Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. During the program, use the comment section to ask a question, and this will enter you into the drawing to win a spring garden flag. And I have it here to show you. See, look how cute. It says Hello Spring, even though it's backwards. So to win that, put a question in the comment section, and I will announce the winner as soon as our program is over, and you can pick it up at the second floor information desk. Annette Heistoffer is here with us today. She is the UK Extension Agent for Horticultural Education in Davis County. She helps to train local master gardeners in our area who are in turn responsible for our seed library. And our seed library is now open, so you can come in and check out 5 packets monthly at no charge to you. Thank you for joining us today, Annette.
Hello, I'm glad to be with everyone today. It's nice and sunny outside, so it really looks like time to garden. And our topic today is early spring gardening. So with the early spring garden, we're going to talk about plants that are suitable for us to grow. And these would be plants then that are able to tolerate cool air temperatures, about that 55 to 65 degrees. Usually they're grown for leaves, stems, or their flower buds. So if you think about cabbage and lettuce, those are all just different parts of the plant that are not necessarily fruit. Growing during the spring's short, cool days, and is planted in the early spring. If we're doing it, or late winter in some cases, if we plant it too late in the spring, the summer heat can cause bolting, and that's the picture that's provided. And with that bolting, it goes to seed. And so when it goes to seed, then it's not edible. And then it can also be bitter and provide some off flavors and some undesirable texture. Usually it's thicker and rougher. And there also, if we plant them too late, the yield will be less. So these are some of the crops that we can plant in our early spring garden. They're beets and lettuce, cabbage, cauliflower, collards, leaf lettuces, kale, mustard greens, onions, peas, potatoes, radishes, spinach, and Swiss chard. And these are all called cool season crops because they tolerate a light frost. Some of these crops, and what we're going to do now is talk about when these can go into the garden, and then we'll talk about each crop individually after that. But we'll also talk a little bit about how to prepare that early spring garden, because it seems like who would have thought we could do any of these kinds of crops now, basically, because spinach could have there about February 15th. Now, with the way our weather has been, it's probably good it wasn't. But we can go ahead and get ready now and plant spinach, followed by peas are also ready to go in the garden. Onion sets, collards, look at the radishes, beets, carrots, kale, micro mustard greens, and onion seeds. So we're going already from February 15th to the collards and onions, which is right around the corner for March the 1st. And coming on to beets about March the 10th, kale about March the 10th, and I gave you a range of time to about early April. I didn't want you to think that if I didn't get the spinach sown on February 15th, I couldn't grow any. So to about early April, remembering that the later you go, it'll be more difficult to grow it and the amount of return may be less. With chard, we can go in about April 15th, March 15th, and then going into April. Leaf lettuces, March 15th. Fib lettuce, also March 15th. And then the onions, again, by plants. And then potatoes, March 15th. Early spring gardening transplants are also great to put in the garden, the cabbage, broccoli, and cauliflower. We don't direct seed those. It takes a little bit longer for those to develop into plants. It's easiest to find those as transplants. If you still want to grow some cabbage, broccoli, or cauliflower by transplants, it's getting a little bit late, but you can try. And at the library, there's already a video from the first part of this month that was on growing your own transplants. But many times these are all locally available as well. So in our early spring garden,
Hey, Annette, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I already have a question for you.
great.
Okay, that question is it possible to use translucent containers to cover plants in early spring? Will enough sunlight filter through?
It depends on your plant, and with that container, you don't want too much heat to build up. These crops can tolerate some of the cooler season. Maybe once you get them out for a couple of days, having something around them to get them used to the weather a little bit. But most of the time, they don't necessarily have to have it. And depends on how translucent, some containers would let enough light in and some may not. And then you may only need it for a short period of time as well. So a good question. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the covers in a moment too. Something you can, maybe that'll help answer the question. Crops need well-drained soil, and they all perform best in full sun. Lettuce can grow in partial shade. Work the soil when it's dry, when we don't have any wet clods coming up. Of course, that's a challenge for us early spring gardening because we tend to have quite a bit of soil moisture at this time of year, but it's best to wait until that soil is dry enough. Otherwise, we ruin the soil texture, which then causes problems with draining of the water away from the plants, and the soil becomes too wet. This is where the advantage of a raised bed comes in, but they do tend to dry out faster, which is good, and it can be bad. And there's no need for a tiller when you're using raised beds. When you're in the garden, testing the soil is important for nutrients. Phosphorus and potassium are needed by the plant, and pH. And these three are tested for in our soil test. And right now, the soil test is free. And I'm glad to cover that over a question if you need to on how to test the soil. But after testing the soil, you bring it to us at the extension office, and then we return the analysis to you in about 7 to 10 days. Remember that it's best to test the soil every 3 to 4 years to determine if we need phosphorus or potassium, or if we need lime. If we add too much lime, then other nutrients won't be available to the plant. If you need lime, it needs to be applied right away because it takes time for that lime to break down and affect the pH by raising the pH. Apply nitrogen, though, only right before you're planting the crop into the area where you're planting it in. We do lose nitrogen, and we don't want it to contaminate any other area. If your soil test result says you don't need any phosphate, then try to find a fertilizer, like an example below with like a 29, a 0 in the middle, the 4, and that's a type of analysis, something similar, because we don't want to add more phosphate, which then leads to contaminating fresh water, and we have the toxic algal blooms. And here's an example when we were talking about the early spring garden that we might need to cover some of the plants, and especially as if you had had spinach planted earlier and trying to keep it through the winter, you would have needed something to cover it. The spunbound material over on the right side would be something that will allow some light in, but over time you would want to remove it. The middle cold frame is great, but just remember, it's like a mini greenhouse and it has to be vented or you could burn your plants, especially on bright sunny days. But they're a great way to get some plants started, whether transplants or if you even grow inside of a cold frame. And then the sketch or cartoon shows a vented plastic, which I like because then don't have to be right there on top of it whenever the sun comes out. But these are ways we can use to extend the beginning of the season. But remember, these are cool season crops, so we won't need these very long. These would be great to save for the early for the spring when we have tomatoes going out in about April, or even squash, and those should be late April.
Annette, I have a question for you. It kind of follows our last question. Somebody asked if they could use a milk jug to cover their plant.
Yes, you can, and you might make sure you take the lid off so it gets a chance again to get not overheat. If you're a little bit later into the season, you could even kind of cut the top out of it so it gives it a little more area for it to get air out and allow it then not to accumulate too much air so that it's heating up too much. So there's a fine line there. With days like today, it could possibly heat up too much. Hopefully, any of the plants that we're growing as transplants, we use them after they have hardened off. Now, if you also might want to create a little, in this colder weather, like you're saying, a mini greenhouse with those, I think that will work. Just again, be careful with the heat and then watch your plants so they don't start to stretch if they're not getting enough light. All those little tips and tricks are things that many times you kind of have to try a little bit yourself and see what your experience is. Water plants as they grow, as they need it in the garden. Usually in the spring garden, we don't really need to water it very much, except if it's in a raised bed, then we might. In the early spring garden, don't use mulch right away in early spring because we want the sunlight to reach the soil and warm it. Of course, after May 1st, we want to conserve soil moisture and then prevent weeds. We might have some early chickweed or henbit come up in the garden, but again, we want to warm up that soil. Are there any questions then about preparing for the garden? The covering is good questions.
No more questions just yet.
Okay, then we're going to go ahead and talk about some of these early spring crops. And when I'm talking about early spring, I'm talking about now and March. We can still things come in April, but remember, we have to tolerate the heat if we can, and sometimes they bolt early or don't keep good quality. But the early spring, I think many times we forget about once March is past and we think, oh, I could have started these already. It's one of those early mid-February crops that we can get growing. So it's great for that cold frame or that situation where people are talking about kind of covering a little bit to get them started. Sow the seed about 1/4 inch deep on a final spacing of
Hey, Annette, I think your signal strength is dropping. If you want to try turning off your video, we can't hear you right now.
turn up. And then we want to make successive plantings. Am I back?
Yes, you're back. I can see you and I can hear you. It just cut out for a second. That was weird.
We want to make successive plantings every 2 to 3 weeks, and it matures in 40 to 70 days. Peas. Peas are something too that's a long season crop. They will produce in the fall, but early spring peas, there's nothing like them. So the potted peas may also be referred to as snow peas or snap peas, and they're eaten with the pod and all. And you can eat them raw or you can cook them. The peas, if they get too big in the pod, then they can be shelled and just eaten as peas. If the pods get too big, they're too tough. So the photograph all the way over to the right is exactly what we need to harvest if we're going to eat them as a snow pea. There are varieties for eating as peas only, just the pea itself, not the pod. And they can be planted into March as well, about 1 inch deep with about 4-inch spacing at the final spacing for them. And it's best to put them on a trellis. Easier to pick, and the peas laying on the soil won't rot that way. Onions. I'm talking about onion sets. It looks like a miniature onion. It's ready to go in the soil about March 1st. And of course, we can go through early April. But this set's about 1 to 2 inches apart. So that's your onion already. It just needs to grow. About 1 to 2 inches deep. So you're just seeing the very little top of it. And we have red, yellow, and white varieties. And many times it's kind of hard to know when to harvest onions, but when the tops fall over about 2/3 of the crop, then you're ready to go ahead and harvest. Onions can also go by seed a little bit later in the month, but I find those are a little bit more challenging to grow. And there are onion plants where you actually see the bulb and more green on top. And those can also go a little bit later in the season. Collards is a vegetable from the cabbage family. It again goes at about mid-March, 1/4 inch deep for the seeds, then about 2 to 4 inches apart, and then you harvest the leaves once they reach suitable size, and you pick the lower ones and let the others grow. So it's a continuous harvest, so that's an advantage of collards. They mature in about 75 to 90 days, and there's big variety of days in between to maturity from when you're planting it to harvest, because there's a lot of different cultivars and varieties out there. It also depends on your conditions too, in addition. Radishes are a crop that just matures in about 20 to 30 days, so successive plantings are really important, maybe 7 to 10 days apart, so you keep a big supply of radishes going. About 1/4 inch deep for sowing the seed, and about 2 to 3 inches apart for final thinning to have great radishes. And the roots would be harvested about 1/2 to 1 inch in diameter. Otherwise, they get woody and they can get hot. Early spring crop, we also have beets. So again, every 3 to 4 weeks, 1/2 to 1/4 inch deep into the soil. And we want to thin them about 2 to 3 inches apart, so the roots all have a chance to grow bigger. Depending on the beet, you can harvest it at 1.5 inches or less in diameter, or you can go a little bit bigger. Just depends on the variety of the beets and what you want to use them for. If you want to can them and have small little beets, that's fine. If it gets too big, then it does tend again to get woody. They mature in about 55 to 60 days. With carrots, you sow those about 1/4 inch deep, 2 to 3 inches between the plants. Fall really is a better time, I think, for carrots, because here they can kind of get bitter. I don't have the best of luck with carrots. Maybe some other individuals do. I just might warn you that sometimes the carrots, if they go bitter, they'll taste like dirt. They mature in about 60 to 80 days, so you might want to keep the garden space for carrots in the fall. Kale. Such a great crop for kale, very nutritious, like many of our vegetables that we have here, of course. So we're sowing seeds in the garden about 1/4 of an inch deep, and then we're thinning to about 8 to 12 inches apart. We can transplant these too if we want, so we could start them indoors earlier if we'd like. There's a variety of kale that is out there. It could be tall, short, flattened. And you'd harvest the leaves about 6 to 8 inches long, and you keep harvesting from the bottom of the plant up. So again, it's a plant that gives you continued amount of supply of kale for a little while. They mature in about 50 to 60 days. Another early green is the mustard green. Very similar, a 1/4 inch deep, thin to about 3 inches apart. And as the leaves get big enough, you can go ahead and use them. Although this crop bolts quite easily when the weather turns hot. Again, remember to continuously plant, and it matures in 35 to 60 days. Again, it depends a little bit on the variety you choose. And as we keep going through these vegetables, it just continues to remind me to tell you that it does provide in my plate, as we look at our nutrition, about half of our plate should be vegetables. So it'd be very easy with these early spring crops. So use Swiss chard is the greens, or you can use the petioles too, the large flattened stems. 10 to 12 inches apart within the row is how they should be spaced. You can, again, start these indoors earlier if you choose, but it also works direct seeding into the garden. Lettuce is a very easy crop. It can't go out as early as spinach, but it can be going out in March. Easy to grow, final spacing about 2 inches apart. They're again planted about a 1/4 inch deep. Harvest when the leaves are just big enough, and if you leave the growing point, it'll keep growing and providing you more lettuce. Successive planting would be a good idea too. 40 to 50 days maturity, and this could be faster, meaning the leaf type is faster than the bib or butterhead type. Those butterhead types need to be thinned to about 4 inches apart, and they mature in 60 to 80 days, and those you would harvest the entire head. Potatoes, the Irish potatoes, we would plant as seed pieces. And you can see those potatoes on the table. And what you would do is cut those apart into about 3 to 4 pieces, just depending on how many eyes there are. And the eyes are actually kind of the indented places that you see on those potatoes, because the potato itself is actually a modified stem. We'd cut those pieces apart, let it air dry for a little bit, and then put it into the soil about 3 to 5 inches deep and space it 10 to 12 inches apart. Use certified seed pieces. This means that they are not carrying diseases. If we just try with any potato, we could get into a problem with diseases, and then those diseases stay in your garden and you can't get rid of them. There are red potatoes, white potatoes, golden yellow potatoes called Yukon Gold. So quite a variety to grow. Now for the crops that we would transplant into the garden, these would be cabbage, about 9 to 12 inches apart in the row. If you want a smaller head, because sometimes some of these varieties produce a huge head that maybe we can't use before it goes to waste. But if you want larger heads, 14 to 16 inches apart, especially if you have the room. The heads are different sizes, colors, leaf type. There's the Savoy, which is wrinkled leaf, and it's very sweet. The red leaf cabbages give us a pretty color to our slaw and other recipes that we use. And they mature in 60 to 100 days, so that one is very cultivar specific. Some of the smaller ones mature in 60 days. Some of the huge, large stonehead type will mature a lot later. Broccoli, plant those 14 to 18 inches apart within the row. There's different types with green head, maybe a yellowish green. Sometimes you see the spirals. So again, there's a variety that's out there to offer. The crown that you see in the middle is harvested, and then allow the side shoots to grow, and you can harvest those side shoots as well. and those side shoots will come over time. And this is a crop to watch for insects into the spring because there are different larvae of about 3 different types of insects that like the broccoli as well as we do, and the cabbage and cauliflower. It matures in about 40 to 90 days. With cauliflower, it's a little more challenging, but well worth growing. Planted about 16 inches apart. We need to cover the head with the leaves, and this is called blanching, to prevent the curd or the head from discoloring or producing off colors and flavors. It's called blanching. You might want a cultivar that's called self-blanching to make the head white, to keep it white. And again, there's white, orange, or purple heads that are available. Matures in about 50 to 100 days. And that does include as a transplant too. All of this information is available through the Home Vegetable Gardening in Kentucky book. And the URL given at the bottom is our Davis County website. So you can look at our website and then go to horticulture and you'll find this book, or call us here at the office at 270-685-8480. And we are glad to provide you with a copy of this information. And I'm glad to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Annette. That was a lot of information, and on such a beautiful day like this, it makes me want to leave work and go garden. We did not have any additional questions, so before we go, I do want to announce our winner of the Spring Garden Flag, and that would be Madeline Ottinger. So Madeline Ottinger, if you'll please come to the second floor information desk, we'll have the flag there waiting for you. And Annette, thank you again for being here today, and I appreciate it, and the information was great, and I hope you get to get out and enjoy this day.
Yes, I think it's time, and I'm about ready to plant my spinach pretty soon.
Yeah, well, you have a great one.
Thank you, and thanks for joining.
Sure.